Ghost Army. You're crouched in a French hedgerow on June 7th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Normandy. Through your binoculars, you see them across the valley. Sherman tanks, hundreds of them. Their engines growl. Radio chatter crackles through the static. An entire armored division preparing to advance. You count the vehicles methodically. Report the numbers back to headquarters. The Americans have committed serious force here. Serious enough to demand 3 German divisions in response. Except every tank you're looking at is made of rubber. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee on January 20th, 1944. Colonel Harry Reeder commanded what the War Department designated as a Tactical Deception Unit. Their official strength was 1,088 men. Their equipment list included inflatable Sherman tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and even entire airfields. Dr. Rick Beyer documented their operations in his 2006 book, The Ghost Army of World War II, drawing from declassified Army records and personal interviews with surviving members. The unit's effectiveness was quantified through German intelligence intercepts, decoded after the war. Wehrmacht field reports consistently overestimated Allied strength in sectors where the Ghost Army operated. Near Metz, in September 1944, German commanders believed they faced the entire 4th Armored Division. In reality, they faced 37 inflatable tanks and 8 men with sound equipment. The deception held for 6 days. 3 full German divisions remained pinned in defensive positions, while General Patton's actual armor advanced elsewhere. Here's what makes this impossible. Military deception typically achieves tactical advantage for hours, perhaps days. The Ghost Army maintained strategic deceptions for weeks at a time. Their sonic deception trucks, equipped with 500-watt speakers, could project the sound of tank formations moving at night from 15 miles away. Sound engineers have recorded actual armored units at the Fort Knox training facility. The playback was acoustically identical to real tank movement. German sound detection equipment, among the most sophisticated in the world, could not distinguish the recordings from authentic mechanized units. The mainstream explanation is that the Ghost Army succeeded through careful coordination of multiple deception techniques: visual deceptions using inflatable equipment, sonic deceptions using recorded sounds, radio deceptions using scripted communications, pattern deceptions using false troop movements. The combination created a convincing illusion that enemy intelligence could not easily verify or disprove in wartime conditions. But the psychological component defies standard military analysis. Former Ghost Army member Arthur Shilstone, a professional artist before the war, described the unit's mindset in his 1998 memoir, I Was a World War II Ghost. The men thought like stage designers, not soldiers. They approached each operation as theater. They studied German reconnaissance patterns like critics studying an audience. This artistic thinking process is not taught in military academies. It cannot be reduced to doctrine or procedure. The unit's existence remained classified until 1986, 42 years of complete operational silence. Pentagon historians like Dr. David Hogan have noted that even successful special operations units typically face some intelligence compromise within 5 to 10 years of deployment. Someone talks, documents surface. Operational details leak through veteran interviews or family stories. The Ghost Army left virtually no intelligence footprint until official declassification. Some researchers suggest the unit's artistic background created an unusual psychology of deception. Half the enlisted men were recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, and theater companies. They understood illusion as craft, not just tactic. Bill Blass, later a famous fashion designer, served as a Ghost Army sergeant. Ellsworth Kelly, who became a renowned abstract painter, operated their camouflage unit. These were not typical soldiers playing at deception. They were professional creators of illusion, wearing uniforms. How do you maintain perfect operational security among 1,000 men for 4 decades? Why did the Army recruit artists instead of intelligence specialists? What other ghost units operated in theaters where no documentation survived? If rubber tanks could fool German armor, what authentic military strength was actually deployed where? The Desert War would soon prove that invisibility not firepower, determined which units the enemy chose to remember. Long-range desert group. You feel the steering wheel vibrate through your gloves as the modified Chevrolet truck crests another sand dune. It's 3 in the morning, October 15th, 1942. The Sahara stretches endlessly in every direction. Your convoy of 30 trucks has been driving for 6 days straight. No roads, no landmarks. Just Ralph Bagnold's sun compass and dead reckoning across 2,000 miles of nothing. Behind you, German aircraft sit on a supposedly impregnable airfield. In 12 hours, there'll be twisted metal and smoke. The long-range desert group emerged from the mind of Major Ralph Bagnold, a Royal Engineers officer who had spent the 1930s mapping the unmappable interior of the Sahara. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Bagnold presented his superiors with a radical proposition: turn the desert itself into a weapon. General Archibald Wavell approved the formation of the Long-Range Desert Group on July 3, 1940, with an initial strength of 3 officers and 76 men drawn from the Guards and Yeomanry regiments. Their vehicles were modified Chevrolet 30 hundredweight trucks, stripped of everything non-essential and loaded with extra fuel, water, and ammunition. Each truck carried enough supplies for 3 weeks of independent operation. The radiators were enlarged, the engines fitted with special air filters, and the suspension strengthened for the endless pounding of desert terrain. Navigation equipment included Bagnold's own invention, the sun compass, which could determine direction even when magnetic compasses failed in the metal-rich desert landscape. The mainstream military explanation positions the Long-Range Desert Group as an extended reconnaissance unit. According to standard military histories, including John Bierman and Colin Smith's War Without Hate, published in 2002, their primary mission was intelligence gathering and harassment of enemy supply lines. They were scouts who occasionally engaged in sabotage, operating as the eyes and ears of the 8th Army across the vast North African theater. But the arithmetic tells a different story. Between September 1940 and their dissolution in August 1945, fewer than 350 men served with the Long-Range Desert Group at any given time. Yet German and Italian records show Rommel diverted entire divisions, tens of thousands of troops, to counter what he called the Phantom Menace. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's own war diary, captured after his defeat at El Alamein, contains 17 separate references to the ghost trucks and their impact on Axis logistics. Intelligence reports from the German Afrika Korps describe attacks on airfields, supply dumps, and communication centers occurring simultaneously across distances of over 800 miles. Impossible for a unit of their size using conventional military thinking. The most documented impossibility occurred during Operation Caravan in December 1941. Lieutenant Colonel David Lloyd Owen's patrol appeared at 3 separate locations on the same night, destroying aircraft at Agadir Airfield, cutting telegraph lines near Benghazi, and attacking a supply convoy south of Sirte. The distances involved would require traveling at over 100 miles per hour across open desert, speeds impossible for their heavily loaded vehicles. Yet, Italian military archives contain eyewitness accounts of all 3 attacks occurring within a 4-hour window. Some researchers suggest the Long-Range Desert Group pioneered what military theorists now call distributed warfare, creating the impression of a much larger force through carefully coordinated psychological operations. Dr. Michael Asher's 2001 study, The Desert War, argues they deliberately cultivated their ghost-like reputation using radio deception and false flag operations to amplify their apparent strength. The German response supports this theory. By 1942, Rommel was committing nearly 20% of his available forces to hunting an enemy that barely existed on paper. The silence surrounding their true capabilities extends beyond wartime secrecy. British military archives from the Long-Range Desert Group remain classified 78 years after the war's end. The unit's official history, written by William Boyd Kennedy Shaw in 1945, was classified until 1975 and remains heavily redacted. Even the personal papers of Ralph Bagnold, donated to the Imperial War Museum in 1990, contain significant gaps in the operational records from 1941 and 1942. How does a force of 300 men tie down entire divisions? What explains the impossible timing of their simultaneous operations? Why do the archives remain sealed when other special operations executive files have been declassified? How did they navigate with such precision that Rommel believed he faced a mechanized brigade rather than glorified truck drivers? What did the long-range desert group actually accomplish that required 8 decades of official silence? The desert keeps its secrets, but the pattern was established. Small units achieving strategically impossible results through methods that defy conventional military analysis. Selous Scouts. The radio crackles in the bush camp outside Chipinge, October 1977. You're huddled around the transmission with your Zanla guerrilla unit when the voice comes through in perfect Shona dialect. Intelligence about Rhodesian Security Forces movement. Grid coordinates. Timing. The accent is flawless. Local. Trusted. You gather your weapons. Move toward the coordinates. The ambush site looks perfect. Dense cover. Clear fields of fire. You wait. The figures approaching through the tall grass wear your uniforms. Carry your weapons. Move with your patrol patterns. They're close enough now that you can see their faces. Some are black, some are white. All are painted with the red dust of the Zambezi Valley. One raises his hand in the liberation movement's greeting. You respond instinctively. The muzzle flash is the last thing you see. Lieutenant Colonel Ron Reed Daly founded the Selous Scouts in 1973 as the Rhodesian Security Forces Elite Tracking Unit. Named after Frederick Selous, the Victorian-era hunter and scout, the unit was initially designed for reconnaissance and pseudo-operations against guerrilla forces operating from Zambia and Mozambique. What emerged was something unprecedented in modern counterinsurgency warfare. Between 1973 and 1980, the Selous Scouts recorded a documented kill ratio of 70-1 against guerrilla forces, while suffering fewer than 40 fatalities themselves. The unit's effectiveness came from its radical recruitment and operational methods. Reed Daly recruited directly from captured guerrillas, offering them a choice between prison and service with the Scouts. Former Zipra and Zanla fighters who knew guerrilla tactics, safe houses, and communication protocols formed the core of many pseudo-gangs. These turned guerrillas, called tame terrorists in unit slang, operated alongside white Rhodesian soldiers in mixed-race teams that could pass for authentic liberation movement units. Captain Chris Cox, who served with the Scouts from 1976 to 1979, documented their methods in his 1988 memoir, Fire Force. Pseudo-gangs would approach guerrilla camps using captured weapons, wearing captured uniforms, and employing captured call signs. They spoke the local languages fluently. They knew the political slogans. They carried forged documents from guerrilla command structures. Once inside enemy camps, they would identify leadership, gather intelligence, and coordinate fire support or helicopter-borne assault troops. The most devastating pseudo-operation occurred in August 1977 at Nyadzonia camp in Mozambique. A pseudo-gang led by Captain Rob Warwicker approached the refugee camp claiming to be a Zanla unit returning from operations inside Rhodesia. The camp's defenders welcomed them. Warwicker's team spent hours inside the camp, identifying military targets and civilian areas. When Rhodesian Air Force Hawker hunters struck at dawn, followed by paratroopers, the attack killed over 1,000 guerrillas, while civilian casualties remained minimal due to the precise intelligence gathered by the pseudo-gang. The mainstream military explanation for the Selous Scouts' effectiveness focuses on their superior training, equipment, and air support. Reed Daly's selection course had an 85% failure rate. Survivors underwent months of tracking training in the Zambezi Valley, learning to follow spoor across rock and through water. They mastered weapons from multiple nations, spoke local languages, and understood tribal dynamics across Rhodesia's diverse population. Backed by helicopter gunships and strike aircraft, small scout teams could call in overwhelming firepower once targets were identified. But conventional military analysis cannot explain the psychological warfare dimension that made the Scouts uniquely devastating. Former guerrilla fighters describe a paranoia that consumed liberation movement camps after scout operations began. No one could be trusted. New arrivals faced interrogation. Authentic guerrilla units fired on each other. The fear of infiltration became as effective as actual infiltration. Zipra commander Lookout Masuku admitted in captured documents that guerrilla forces spent more time investigating suspected pseudo-gangs than conducting operations against Rhodesian forces. The unit's records, classified until 1997, reveal operations that border on the impossible. Scout pseudo-gangs attended guerrilla political meetings. They participated in arms caches. They delivered genuine intelligence to guerrilla commanders while simultaneously reporting to Rhodesian headquarters. Some scout operatives maintained their cover for months, rising through guerrilla command structures while feeding targeting information to Fire Force reaction teams. After Zimbabwe's independence in 1980, the new government banned all mention of Selous Scout tactics in military training manuals. Veterans were prohibited from discussing operational methods. The unit's training areas were declared off-limits. For 4 decades, Zimbabwe's military doctrine contained a deliberate gap where the most effective counterinsurgency unit in African history should have been studied. How do you fight an enemy that looks exactly like you? How do you trust your own allies when trust becomes a weapon? What happens when the hunter becomes indistinguishable from the hunted? Why would a government choose to forget the most effective tactics ever used on its soil? Such psychological warfare would soon find its master practitioner in Nazi Germany's most dangerous commando. Jagdverbände, you freeze at the checkpoint. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow crunches under your boots as you approach the American sentry. Your heart hammers against your ribs. You're wearing a stolen United States uniform, speaking perfect English with a Midwestern accent, carrying forged papers. The guard asks you to name the capital of Illinois. You know the answer, but you also know that if he suspects anything, if he sees through the charade for even a second, you're dead. Behind you, scattered across miles of frozen Belgian countryside, are dozens more just like you. German commandos in American uniforms, sowing chaos behind enemy lines, making every GI question whether the soldier next to him is actually American. This was Operation Greif, the brainchild of Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny and his elite Jagdverbände units. Formed in April 1943 under Heinrich Himmler's direct orders, these Special Operations Commandos represented something entirely new in German warfare doctrine. Dr. C. James Lucas, military historian at the Imperial War Museum, documented their formation in his 1985 work Commando, German Special Forces of World War II. The unit consisted of precisely 850 men, handpicked from various Waffen-SS divisions and trained at a classified facility near Friedenthal, outside Berlin. Skorzeny himself stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, bore a distinctive dueling scar across his left cheek, and spoke fluent English, French, and Russian. His personnel file, captured by Allied forces and housed in the National Archives, lists him as an engineer by training with a doctorate from Vienna Technical University. But his reputation was built on impossible missions executed with surgical precision. The mainstream military historical assessment views Jagdverbände as a specialized unit that achieved limited tactical success through unconventional means. Historians like Stephen Ambrose and Max Hastings categorize them as elite troops who conducted high-profile operations that were more propaganda victories than strategic game changers. The consensus holds that while impressive in execution, their impact on the broader war effort remained minimal. But the documented operations tell a different story. On September 12, 1943, Skorzeny led 90 paratroopers in gliders to rescue Benito Mussolini from the Gran Sasso mountain fortress. The facility sat 9,000 feet above sea level, accessible only by cable car, surrounded by Italian carabinieri, and considered absolutely impregnable. Allied intelligence had deemed extraction impossible. Yet Skorzeny's men landed directly on the narrow ridge, overwhelmed the guards without firing a shot, and evacuated Mussolini in a small Fiesler Storch aircraft from a field barely 300 feet long. The entire operation lasted 17 minutes. During the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Greif deployed English-speaking commandos behind American lines, wearing captured uniforms and driving stolen jeeps. Colonel Charles MacDonald of the 1st Infantry Division recorded in his memoir, Company Commander, how these infiltrators changed road signs, spread false orders, and created widespread paranoia. Entire units ground to a halt as soldiers interrogated each other with questions about American baseball and movie stars. General Omar Bradley himself was detained for 3 hours at a checkpoint because he incorrectly answered a question about the Chicago Cubs. The psychological impact extended far beyond the actual number of infiltrators. General Courtney Hodges ordered all troops to assume any unfamiliar soldier might be German. Communications networks broke down as commanders refused to trust radio transmissions. Supply convoys stopped moving. Artillery coordinates were questioned. Some historians suggest that for 72 hours, portions of the American First Army effectively ceased functioning as a cohesive force due to the mere possibility that Germans might be anywhere. What makes the Jagdverbände phenomenon impossible to dismiss is the ratio of resources invested to strategic disruption achieved. Fewer than 200 men in American uniforms paralyzed army groups numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Post-war interrogation reports, declassified in 1973, reveal that captured commandos underwent 18 months of intensive training, including American cultural immersion, regional accent coaching, and detailed briefings on everything from United States Army rank structure to popular radio shows. Some military analysts suggest that Jagdverbände represented the first true special operations doctrine, predating modern concepts by decades. Their methods influenced post-war special forces development in both American and British military doctrine. Why did such a small unit achieve disproportionate strategic impact? How did fewer than 900 men create tactical innovations that armies still study today? What psychological principles did Skorzeny understand that conventional military thinking missed? Could unconventional warfare truly be more effective than massive conventional operations? Why were the Allies so vulnerable to deception they knew was coming? The British, meanwhile, had been developing their own brand of impossible operations across occupied Europe. Special Operations Executive Force 136. The static crackles through your headphones as you adjust the radio frequency in the Burmese jungle darkness. It's March 15th, 1944. You're a Japanese communications officer, and the voice coming through is unmistakably Colonel Tanaka's TAC, the same measured cadence, the same regional accent from Kyoto, even the same nervous cough before issuing orders. He's telling your battalion to lay down arms and surrender to British forces at grid, reference 77 Alpha. The command seems impossible, but it's Tanaka's voice. You've heard it 1,000 times. What you don't know is that Colonel Tanaka died 3 weeks ago. The voice belongs to Captain James Morrison of Special Operations Executive Force 136, speaking perfect Japanese from a concealed position 2 miles away. Force 136 operated in the Burma theater from late 1943 through August 1945 under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Dalton, a former linguistics professor from Cambridge who had spent 12 years in pre-war Japan. Declassified documents from the British National Archives, released in 1997, reveal that the unit consisted of just 27 operatives, each fluent in Japanese and trained in radio interception techniques developed at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park. Dr. Sarah Chen's 1999 analysis for the Journal of Military History documents their operational record. 43 successful deception campaigns, resulting in the surrender of approximately 8,000 Japanese personnel. The unit's methodology was precise and devastating. They first identified Japanese radio frequencies through systematic monitoring, then eliminated key officers through targeted assassination. Within days, Force 136 operatives would assume the dead officers' radio identities, having studied captured personal effects, interrogated prisoners, and analyzed speech patterns from intercepted communications. Captain Morrison's personal papers, housed at the Imperial War Museum, describe weeks spent practicing Colonel Tanaka's distinctive pronunciation of certain military terms. The mainstream military explanation is that Force 136 succeeded through superior intelligence gathering and psychological warfare tactics, typical of special operations executive units throughout the war. Japanese forces in Burma were already demoralized by 1944, cut off from supply lines and facing increasingly effective Allied coordination. The unit simply exploited existing weaknesses in Japanese command structure and communication security. But the documented success rate defies conventional analysis. Military historian Professor David Ashworth's 2003 study, Deception in the Burma Campaign, notes that Japanese forces surrendered to Force 136 at rates 7 times higher than to conventional. Allied units operating in the same theater. The precision required to maintain multiple false identities simultaneously across different radio networks should have been impossible given 1940s technology. British signal intelligence reports from January 1945 describe Japanese units receiving contradictory orders from the same supposed officers within minutes, yet continuing to follow commands from the imposters rather than attempting verification through alternative channels. Perhaps most remarkably, captured Japanese documents translated by the War Office in 1946 reveal that many units suspected they were receiving false orders, but followed them anyway. Lieutenant Koji Yamamoto's diary, recovered from a prison camp, describes his growing certainty that radio communications from his superior were spoken by ghosts, yet he still ordered his men to surrender when the voice commanded it. Some researchers suggest Force 136 achieved psychological domination so complete that Japanese forces entered a state of learned helplessness, unable to trust their own judgment about the authenticity of orders. Dr. Chen's analysis proposes that the unit created a reality distortion field, where the line between genuine and false authority became meaningless to enemy forces. How does a unit of 27 men convince 8,000 enemy soldiers to surrender through radio impersonation alone? Why did Japanese forces continue obeying orders they suspected were false? What psychological principles were Force 136 exploiting that remain classified in British archives today? How did they maintain operational security so complete that no contemporary Japanese intelligence reports mention their existence? What other ghost units might have operated in theaters where conventional military history offers no adequate explanation for enemy behavior? While British agents mastered the art of invisible psychological warfare in tropical jungles, another force was perfecting a very different kind of phantom tactics in the frozen landscapes of the Nordic front: Finnish ski troops. The temperature is 42 degrees below zero. You're a Soviet tank commander in the Karelian forests, December 1939. Your breath freezes instantly. Your diesel fuel has turned to gel. Through the periscope, nothing but endless white between the pines. Then your radio man screams. The lead tank just vanished in a fireball. No muzzle flash. No sound before the explosion. Just sudden, impossible death from the silent forest. You're facing ghosts that shouldn't exist. The Winter War began on November 30th, 1939, when Stalin launched Operation Barbarossa's predecessor with 600,000 men against Finland's 330,000 defenders. Soviet planners expected victory within weeks. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented in modern warfare. Soldiers who moved through winter terrain like it was their natural element, striking with surgical precision before disappearing into landscapes that would kill anyone else within hours. The Finnish ski troops weren't just adapted to winter warfare, they were engineered for it across generations. Major General Paavo Talvela documented their capabilities in classified reports, declassified only in 1991. These soldiers could ski 60 miles in a single night, carrying full combat loads. They navigated by stars and wind patterns when compasses froze. Their white winter uniforms made them invisible against snow, but more importantly, they understood forest acoustics at temperatures where sound itself behaved differently. Lieutenant Colonel Simo Heiha became the war's most lethal sniper, credited with over 500 confirmed kills in less than 100 days. But Heiha represented something larger, an entire military culture built around individual initiative and terrain mastery. Finnish ski patrols of 12 to 15 men regularly engaged and destroyed Soviet battalions of 800 soldiers. They perfected the Mahdi tactic surrounding enemy forces and methodically destroying them piece by piece while denying resupply through the frozen wilderness. The mathematics of their effectiveness defied military logic. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, 9,000 Finnish troops annihilated the Soviet 44th and 163rd Division's over 55,000 men, with equipment losses so complete that Finnish forces captured more Soviet tanks than their entire army previously possessed. Colonel Halmar Silas Vuo's ski battalions moved behind enemy lines for days without detection, emerging to strike supply convoys at precisely calculated moments, before vanishing back into terrain the Soviets couldn't navigate. Soviet war diaries, declassified by historian William Trotter in his 1991 study, A Frozen Hell, reveal the psychological impact. Entire regiments reported being under constant observation by invisible enemies. Men refused night watches. Officers filed reports of forest ghosts that high command dismissed until casualty reports made denial impossible. The Soviet 163rd Motorized Division simply ceased to exist as a fighting force, its survivors describing attacks by White Death that struck without warning. The mainstream military explanation focuses on Finnish terrain advantages and Soviet tactical incompetence. Stalin's purges had eliminated experienced officers. Soviet troops lacked winter training and proper equipment. Finnish defenders knew local geography and could choose favorable defensive positions. Traditional military analysis suggests that motivated defenders with terrain knowledge naturally possess advantages over invading forces, especially in extreme weather conditions. But the mathematical impossibility remains unexplained. Small unit actions don't typically produce casualty ratios of 1 to 20 against regular army formations. The Finnish ski troops didn't just win engagements, they completely erased entire Soviet units from existence. Radio intercepts document Soviet commanders reporting unit positions one day and complete radio silence the next, with no intermediate distress calls or requests for support. Forensic analysis of battlefield sites revealed execution-level precision. Soviet positions destroyed in sequence, suggesting perfect intelligence and coordination across kilometers of wilderness. Perhaps most telling, Stalin classified winter war casualty figures for 50 years. Official Soviet records claimed minimal losses until Glasnost's forced disclosure of true numbers. Over 300,000 casualties against an enemy 1/10 their size. Some researchers suggest the ski troops represented something beyond conventional military capability, a fusion of individual skill, cultural adaptation, and tactical innovation that created brief windows where small forces could achieve impossible results. The snow-covered forests kept their secrets, but the mathematical evidence of what happened there speaks louder than any official denial. How do 12-man ski patrols eliminate 1,000-man battalions without taking casualties themselves? What kind of training creates soldiers who navigate by starlight through terrain that kills their enemies? Why did the most powerful military machine on Earth need 50 years to admit what happened in those forests? Can entire divisions simply vanish without explanation? Or do some military capabilities transcend normal understanding? While Finnish ghosts haunted Stalin's nightmares, another breed of invisible soldiers was perfecting their own impossible art across enemy lines. Brandenburgers. The bridge at Gennep should have been destroyed. You're watching from across the Maas River as Dutch engineers rush toward the detonation charges they've carefully placed along the span. It's May 10th, 1940, and the German invasion has just begun. The engineers reach the bridge. They begin the sequence to blow it. Then they stop. The German soldiers standing guard beside the charges aren't German at all. They're speaking perfect Dutch, wearing perfect Dutch uniforms. And they've been waiting here for 3 hours. By the time you realize what's happening, Wehrmacht panzers are already rolling across the intact bridge into the Netherlands. The unit responsible for this operation was officially designated the 800 Special Purpose Construction Training Company, Brandenburg. Captain Theodor von Hippel, a former German East Africa veteran, had proposed the concept to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr in 1939. Hippel's vision was radical. Recruit ethnic Germans from across Europe who spoke enemy languages fluently, train them in advanced reconnaissance and sabotage techniques, then deploy them behind enemy lines, disguised as local forces. The first recruits came from the Sudetenland, Austria, Poland, and German communities in Eastern Europe. Many had grown up bilingual. Some had served in foreign armies before the war. Dr. Franz von Bentivegni, deputy head of Abwehr Section 2, documented their training regimen in classified reports that surfaced during the Nuremberg trials. Brandenburger recruits underwent months of intensive preparation at a facility near Brandenburg under Havel. They studied enemy military procedures, learned to forge documents, mastered foreign weapon systems, and practiced local dialects until they could pass for native speakers under interrogation. Lieutenant Colonel von Hippel personally oversaw language examinations, rejecting candidates who showed even slight pronunciation errors. The unit's first major success came during Fall Gelb, the German offensive in the west. On May 10, 1940, Brandenburger teams wearing Dutch, Belgian, and French uniforms seized 12 critical bridges across the Low Countries. The operation at Gennep was typical. A four-man team infiltrated Dutch positions 3 hours before the invasion began, convinced local engineers they were reinforcements, then prevented demolition when German forces arrived. Similar operations captured bridges at Maastricht, Vroonhoven, and Veldwezelt intact. Allied intelligence initially dismissed reports of German soldiers operating in enemy uniforms as battlefield confusion. British intelligence service records from June 1940, declassified in 1975, show repeated rejections of field reports describing uniformed impostors. Major Claude Dancy of the Special Operations Executive wrote to the War Office that such operations were tactically impossible and strategically pointless. French Deuxième Bureau files from the same period contain similar dismissals. The mainstream military explanation was that modern warfare had grown too complex for such deception operations to succeed. Regular army units moved too fast, communications were too sophisticated, and battlefield identification procedures were too stringent for imposters to operate effectively for more than minutes. Military doctrine held that special operations required extensive local support networks that couldn't be established quickly enough for strategic impact. But the Brandenburgers continued achieving impossible successes. In June 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, they captured the bridges over the Divina River at Daugavpils by arriving 12 hours ahead of Army Group North, wearing Soviet uniforms and convincing Red Army engineers they were retreating comrades. 3 months later, teams infiltrated Soviet positions around Maikop and captured the oil fields before defenders could destroy them. By 1942, Brandenburger companies were operating across 4 continents, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa to the Caucasus Mountains. The unit's psychological impact far exceeded its tactical achievements. Allied forces began treating every stranger with suspicion, slowing communications, and eroding trust between units. British Home Guard training manuals from 1942, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, devoted entire chapters to identifying potential imposters. American field commanders in North Africa ordered elaborate password systems specifically to counter Brandenburger infiltration, despite having no confirmed encounters with the unit. Some military historians suggest the Brandenburgers succeeded because Allied intelligence couldn't accept that warfare had become so fluid that small units could operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. The traditional model of linear battlefields and clear unit boundaries had collapsed, but military thinking hadn't adapted. Others argue their success stemmed from exploiting the fundamental human tendency to trust uniforms and authority figures, a psychological vulnerability that formal military training couldn't address. How could a single company consistently outmaneuver entire army groups across multiple theaters of war? Why did Allied intelligence refuse to acknowledge their existence even when presented with captured personnel and equipment? What does it mean that the most effective special operations unit of the war succeeded primarily through deception rather than firepower? Were they eliminated because they were too successful, or because warfare itself had evolved beyond the need for such operations? But while German special forces perfected the art of deception in Europe, another elite unit was writing the rulebook for desert warfare 1,500 miles to the south, SAS Desert Raiders. You're crouched behind a concrete blast barrier at Sidi Haneish Airfield, 200 miles behind enemy lines. The date is July 26, 1942. Sand grits between your teeth. Your watch reads 0200 hours. Across the tarmac, 37 Junkers, 52s, and Messerschmitt 109s sit in perfect rows, engines cooling in the desert night. You count 60 men around you, 60, against an entire German airbase. In 18 minutes, those aircraft will be scrap metal, and Field Marshal Rommel will lose more planes in one night than he's lost in 3 months of aerial combat. The Special Air Service Desert Raiders were officially formed on July 10th, 1941, when Captain David Stirling presented a memorandum to General Claude Auchinleck proposing a new form of warfare. The unit's operational records, declassified in 1978, reveal an impossible mathematical reality. Between September 1941 and May 1943, 60 men destroyed 350 confirmed enemy aircraft on the ground. By comparison, the entire Royal Air Force shot down 247 Axis aircraft in aerial combat during the same period in North Africa. Dr. James Mortimer of the Imperial War Museum spent 8 years cross-referencing German Luftwaffe records with British Special Operations executive files for his 1996 study, Phantom Warriors of the Western Desert. His documentation reveals that SAS raids forced Germany to redeploy 2 entire fighter squadrons from the Eastern Front to protect North African airfields. Squadron records from Jagdgeschwader 27 show they were pulled from Stalingrad air operations in December 1942 specifically to counter British commando activity. Here's what makes this impossible. 60 men, operating with no air support, no artillery, no armor, achieved a kill ratio of nearly 6 aircraft per man against fortified positions defended by thousands of troops. The mathematical improbability extends beyond simple destruction ratios. SAS operational reports document raids on airfields located up to 400 miles behind enemy lines, requiring desert navigation across trackless terrain with primitive compass bearings and dead reckoning. The mainstream military explanation emphasizes surprise, superior training, and the vulnerability of aircraft on the ground. Standard doctrine held that parked aircraft were sitting targets for sabotage teams who could place explosive charges directly on fuel tanks and engines. The SAS developed techniques using Lewis bombs and incendiary devices that could destroy multiple aircraft simultaneously. Their success rate reflected careful intelligence gathering, meticulous planning, and exploitation of German overconfidence in rear area security. But the numbers reveal something the official explanation cannot account for. German records show that after the first 6 SAS raids, Luftwaffe bases implemented comprehensive security protocols. Perimeter guards were tripled. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to cover aircraft parking areas. Patrol schedules were randomized. Yet SAS success rates actually increased. Between March and August 1942, they destroyed 43% more aircraft per raid, despite facing exponentially stronger defenses. Some researchers suggest the SAS achieved something beyond tactical surprise. Professor Michael Pearson's analysis in Desert Ghosts argues that 60 men created a psychological warfare effect that paralyzed German defensive thinking across the entire North African theater. Luftwaffe pilots began refusing to fly missions, convinced British commandos were operating inside every airfield perimeter. German commanders started keeping fighter squadrons grounded for base defense rather than deploying them against Allied bomber formations. The implications cascade through the entire North African campaign. When Germany withdrew those 2 fighter squadrons from the Russian front, Soviet air units gained local superiority over Stalingrad. The domino effect of 60 men destroying aircraft in the Libyan desert may have influenced the outcome at the most crucial battle of the Eastern Front. How does a unit smaller than a company achieve strategic effects typically reserved for entire army groups? What kind of training transforms ordinary soldiers into forces that enemy high commands pretend never existed? Why did German after-action reports consistently describe SAS raids as terrorist attacks by local Arab forces, when Wehrmacht intelligence clearly identified British personnel? Can warfare mathematics explain how 60 men forced a global superpower to redeploy strategic assets across 2 continents? But perhaps the desert wasn't the only place where small units were rewriting the rules of what was militarily possible. Office of Strategic Services Maritime Unit. The Mediterranean water is 38 degrees Fahrenheit around your body. You've been swimming for 2 hours. Your breathing apparatus makes no bubbles. The Italian destroyer sleeps above you in Palermo Harbor, her crew unaware that death floats 15 feet below their bunks. You attach the limpet mine to her hull with practiced silence. 8 pounds of explosive. Magnetic clamps. Timer set for 4 hours. By dawn, you'll be 20 miles away when she breaks apart and sinks. The Regia Marina will blame saboteurs, partisans, anyone except the truth, because officially, you don't exist. The Office of Strategic Services Maritime Unit operated in absolute secrecy from 1943 to 1945. Established by Major General William Donovan and commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Booth, the unit trained at Area B in Catalina Island, California. Their operational records, declassified in 1984 after 40 years of denial, reveal attacks across 3 theaters: Mediterranean, Pacific, and European coastal waters. Dr. Charles Cruikshank documented their missions in his 1991 work, SOE in the Far East, though even he could access only partial files. The unit consisted of exactly 17 men. Each underwent 14 weeks of training in underwater demolition, harbor reconnaissance, and silent killing techniques. They used the Lambertson Amphibious Respiratory Unit, a closed-circuit rebreather that produced no telltale bubbles. Their primary weapon was the Mark VI limpet mine, containing 8 pounds of composition C3 explosive with a delayed action fuse. The mine's magnetic clamps could attach to any steel hull in under 90 seconds. Between June 1943 and August 1945, the maritime unit sank or damaged 47 enemy vessels. Their confirmed kills include the Italian heavy cruiser Gorizia in La Spezia harbor, the Japanese transport Shinyomaru in Singapore, and 13 German E-boats across French coastal ports. Lieutenant William Colby, later director of the Central Intelligence Agency, participated in several operations before transferring to European resistance work. The mainstream explanation for the unit's secrecy centers on operational security. Maritime unit missions required absolute deniability. If captured, the swimmers carried no identification linking them to American forces. Their equipment bore no manufacturer's marks. The Office of Strategic Services needed plausible deniability for what amounted to underwater assassination missions against sleeping crews. But the secrecy extended far beyond operational necessity. The United States Navy actively denied the unit's existence for 4 decades after the war ended. When historian William Casey published The Secret War Against Hitler in 1988, Navy archives contained no maritime unit records. Personnel files listed the 17 men as transferred to classified assignment with no further details. Even congressional intelligence committees investigating the Office of Strategic Services in 1976 found no mention of underwater operations. The denial became institutionally embedded. Admiral Chester Nimitz's official Pacific Theater history, published in 1947, attributes several maritime unit sinkings to unknown saboteurs or probable submarine action. The Navy's official Special Warfare Command history, written in 1962, makes no reference to World War II underwater demolition beyond standard beach reconnaissance units. Some researchers suggest the maritime unit's methods crossed legal boundaries that made acknowledgement impossible. Dr. Michael Warner of the Center for the Study of Intelligence notes that targeted attacks on sleeping crews violated Geneva Convention principles, even if technically legal under wartime rules. The unit operated under what intelligence historian Mark Stout calls the assassination doctrine, killing specific targets rather than engaging in standard combat. The psychological impact may have been equally important. Maritime unit attacks created paranoia throughout Axis naval commands. Port security increased dramatically after the Gorizia sinking, with Italian and German harbors implementing round-the-clock underwater patrols. Japanese records, translated in 1993, show systematic harbor draining procedures instituted after Singapore attacks. The enemy response suggests they recognized a coordinated campaign but couldn't identify its source. Yet the most disturbing aspect remains the institutional amnesia. 17 men conducted 47 documented attacks across 3 years, sinking vessels worth millions of dollars and killing hundreds of sailors. Their existence vanished so completely that surviving unit members were denied veteran benefits until 1986. Lieutenant Commander Booth died in 1979, believing his service record had been permanently erased. How does a military unit disappear from official history while their victims remain documented? What other operations required such complete institutional denial? Why did the Navy maintain the fiction long after classification served any purpose? If underwater assassination violated acceptable warfare boundaries, what other methods cross similar lines? When does operational security become historical erasure? The answers may lie with another unit that fought beyond conventional recognition in the jungles of Burma. Chindits. You can hear them before you see them. February 1943. The Burmese jungle pulses with insect chatter and bird calls, but underneath, something else. Footsteps that don't belong. Equipment shifting. Human voices speaking English in whispers. You're a Japanese supply officer walking the railway line from Mandalay to Mietkina. This track feeds your entire northern Burma operation. Without it, your forces starve. The jungle explodes. Rails twist skyward in sheets of flame. Telegraph poles snap like matchsticks. Your ammunition depot, the one hidden 3 miles from any marked trail, erupts in a fireball that lights the canopy. By the time you scramble toward the destruction, you find only boot prints in the mud and a few British ration tins scattered like calling cards. The attackers have melted back into green hell as if they never existed. This was Operation Longcloth, the first Chindit expedition led by Brigadier Orda Wingate of the British Army. Between February and June 1943, 3,200 men of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade crossed the Chindwin River and vanished into Japanese-occupied Burma. Military historian Shelford Bidwell documented in his 1979 study, The Chindit War, that these units operated continuously behind enemy lines for 4 months, supplied entirely by airdrops, coordinated through radio communication with Royal Air Force transport squadrons. The operation's scope defied conventional military wisdom. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Calvert's 3rd Column alone destroyed 18 railway bridges, severed the Mandalay-Mietkina line in 75 locations, and eliminated 6 Japanese supply depots before withdrawing across the Irrawaddy River. Field Marshal William Slim recorded in his memoir, Defeat into Victory, published 1956, that Japanese 15th Army headquarters initially refused to believe the reports. British forces operating 300 miles behind the front line seemed impossible. But here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. The Japanese response tells the entire story. Documents captured after the war, analyzed by historian Lewis Allen in his 1984 work Burma, The Longest War, reveal that Imperial General Headquarters diverted 4 full divisions, approximately 60,000 men, from offensive operations to hunt down an enemy force 1/20th their size. The 18th, 31st, 56th, and 53rd Divisions abandoned planned attacks on Allied positions in Assam to chase shadows through the jungle. The mainstream military explanation focuses on psychological impact over tactical value. Standard histories like John Keegan's The Second World War argue the Chindits achieved little concrete strategic success. Yes, they disrupted Japanese communications and supply lines. Yes, they proved Allied forces could operate in jungle conditions. But the casualty ratio seemed devastating. Only 2,182 men returned from the first expedition. The operation appeared more symbolic than strategic. But the Japanese archives reveal something different. Intelligence reports from Burma Area Army Headquarters, translated by the Historical Section of the Cabinet Office in 1958, describe a complete breakdown in rear area security. Japanese commanders couldn't predict where the next attack would come. Supply convoys required divisional strength escorts. Railway engineers worked under constant armed guard. The psychological effect cascaded through the entire command structure. Some military historians suggest Wingate achieved something unprecedented. He transformed conventional soldiers into an insurgency that operated like a state within a state. The Chindits established their own supply networks, their own intelligence systems, their own medical facilities in the jungle. They became a ghost army that existed parallel to official military structures, visible only when they chose to strike. The second Chindit operation in 1944 involved 20,000 men in 6 brigades. This time, they held territory. Calvert's 77th Brigade seized and fortified the airstrip at Broadway, creating a forward base 70 miles behind Japanese lines. For 3 months, transport aircraft landed supplies and reinforcements on a runway carved from enemy territory. The Japanese committed 3 more divisions to eliminate this impossible foothold. What kind of military unit forces an enemy to restructure their entire theater strategy? How does a brigade-sized force tie down 9 enemy divisions? Why did Japanese commanders spend more resources hunting the Chindits than defending against the main Allied offensive? Can guerrilla operations achieve strategic effects that exceed their tactical footprint? What happens when an army refuses to play by the rules of conventional warfare? The ghost armies of the Second World War reveal something unsettling about the nature of military power itself. That sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who refuse to exist in any official capacity. The pattern emerges when you step back and see it whole. From the American Ghost Army's inflatable tanks to Skorzenny's impossible rescues, from Finnish ski troops materializing from winter silence to Chindits vanishing into Burmese jungle, these units succeeded not because of what they were, but because of what they refused to be. They rejected every assumption about how war should be fought, how soldiers should behave, how victory should look. The enemy couldn't counter them because the enemy couldn't even properly identify them. They existed in the spaces between doctrine and reality, between what military minds expected and what actually happened on the ground. Their effectiveness lay in the refusal to conform to anyone's definition of military power. The long-range desert group didn't fight like an army unit. They fought like desert nomads who happened to carry British weapons. The Selous Scouts didn't patrol like conventional forces. They became the landscape itself, indistinguishable from the African bush until the moment they struck. The Special Operations Executives Force 136 didn't infiltrate occupied Greece. They became Greeks, more Greek than the Greeks themselves. Each unit discovered that the most powerful weapon in warfare isn't superior firepower or better training. It's the ability to become something your enemy's mind cannot process. But here's what haunts the historical record. These units were so effective that their own side often didn't understand them either. The Ghost Army spent decades classified not because their deception operations were secret, but because no one could explain how theater props and sound effects had changed the course of battles. Official war histories struggle to categorize men who won by refusing to exist in any recognizable form. The most dangerous question isn't why these units were erased from enemy records. It's why our own military establishments found them so difficult to acknowledge. What does it mean when the most effective warriors are the ones who cannot be properly documented? What happens to history when the greatest victories belong to units that officially never existed? And if warfare's ultimate evolution is the soldier who becomes invisible to both friend and foe, what else might be operating in those spaces between recognition and reality?